right. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate you guys taking the time out of this snowy day to come talk about photogrammetry, drone mapping, accuracy, efficiency, all of that good stuff. By way of introduction, my name is Logan Campbell. I am a certified mapping scientist with ASPRS. I am also the founder and CEO of Aerotas. And with me, I have Jeff Miller of Pix4D. I'll let him give an introduction of himself too.
Thank you for that, Logan. So yeah, Pix4D, I'm a senior technical trainer there. Familiar face or two if you've had one of my classes over the last couple of years. So anyways, my background is in photogrammetry. Been at Pix now for a couple of years, but before that I was consultant, vendor, you name it, but always been kind of a photogrammetry purist, and now that we have drones, it's just the next great revolution, right? Anyways, yeah, really excited to demonstrate today with Logan some practical solutions and talk about accuracy and demonstrate how Pix4D in particular can how to go through that workflow of figuring out your accuracy from our software. So take it away.
Cool.
Thank you.
So what we're going to cover today, as the title kind of implies, is we're going to go over what it takes to get to accuracy and efficiency using drone photogrammetry. So that means we're going to actually walk you through what a complete drone workflow ought to look like with both of those key goals in mind. And that means everything from mission planning, setting ground control and checkpoints, standard operating procedures, all of the kind of pre-flight and during flight stuff, including some of the after-flight processing stuff, which is where Pix4D comes in, your photogrammetry processing, measuring accuracy, and then data extraction, going kind of that next step beyond a lot of those files. Now, probably everyone in here knows what Pix4D is, market-leading photogrammetry software out there, but a few of you probably don't know about Aerotas. We are proud Pix4D users, and among what you would call kind of Pix4D power users, that we have a handful of ASPRS certified scientists, technicians, and photogrammetrists on staff with us that actually use Pix4D every single day to go to work with land surveyors and civil engineers and go from flying a drone to actual survey-grade CAD deliverables. So that's what our company does in a nutshell. So the end goal today of what everyone is ultimately trying to get to when it comes to photogrammetry, first off, is better deliverables. What we're working with are projects that would typically be surveyed or measured through some alternative method anyway. So whether that's land surveying, you're going around with the basin rover, other types of traditional photogrammetry or remote sensing as well. But the goal of using a drone photogrammetry is better deliverables. That means higher resolution, higher accuracy, imagery where you wouldn't otherwise have it, things like that. But that's not the only goal. In fact, we also need to make sure that we save time on this too. And to take it even one step further, we need to save money. I'm a big fan of saying if your drone program isn't saving you time and money, then it isn't doing its job. Because if it's not doing that, it's not actually a drone program, it's a research program at that point. You're just kind of playing around with that. So that really ties into the theme that I was talking about earlier today of accuracy and efficiency. So a lot of the steps that we'll go through are entirely focused on efficiency, some entirely on accuracy, to get to these key goals: better deliverables, faster and cheaper than you'd be able to get through alternative methods. So here's just kind of an example of when I think about what a finished deliverable from drone photogrammetry ought to look like. This is what it should look like. And for anyone that's familiar with surveying or civil engineering and looks at this, there's nothing on here that says it was taken with a drone. For all you know, that could be a satellite-based map. The only thing that matters is that it's highly accurate. All of the line work and planimetrics on there are exactly what the client needs and are highly accurate as well. And the imagery is, of course, up to date with the project site. And, of course, that kind of bottom thing in the right, the actual surveyor's seal that says, yes, this is certified accurate, and I'm willing to show up to court in case something is off with this. That is the type of thing that really, really matters in these types of programs. And that's also where the ASPRS side really comes in. Using the ASPRS positional accuracy standards, which we're going to dive into a heck of a lot more later today as well, is important for actually certifying this by saying that you can either use drone photogrammetry that is then tested to meet or produced to meet the ASPRS positional accuracy standards. As I continue to dive in further, I should point out my kind of presentation style here. I like questions, so feel free at any point throughout the entire presentation, raise your hand, yell at me, throw stuff up at the stage. Maybe at Jeff, not me, preferably, but you can get my attention, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that might come up. All right, so when we say a complete workflow to go from, drone to final product, what does that actually look like? More or less, there are about 6 steps the way that we see it. First step is actually planning the project, knowing where you're going to fly, all your flight overlap stuff, setting your GCP targets, then going out, collecting data in the field, which, actually by a show of hands, who here is a Part 107 pilot? Just kind of curious that actually flies. Okay, awesome, good. That also means if you're doing it for photogrammetry, you know that the collecting data phase is actually really easy. Draw a square and push, go. That's it, it's very easy. The rest of the workflow is what gets trickier. Photogrammetry, obviously that's the most computationally expensive part here. That's where Pix4D comes in. And then drafting your line work and finishing it in CAD. Those last 2 steps kind of getting to that final deliverable as well. In general, those first 3 steps are going to be what we call the field data collection component. Last 3 are going to be the office component where you're actually kind of in the office. Even though I suppose some of the kind of planning part at the beginning is going to be in the office as well as you just get ready for a mission. So let's just dive right into it. And let's start out with mission planning and what mission planning looks like. So first off, when we say mission planning, what do we mean? What is mission planning? So first off, is this a good site for drone photogrammetry? For those of you that have or haven't flown, you know that some sites are great candidates for photogrammetry, some are terrible. This could include everything from site size. If you have a 10-acre site and you say, I want to fly a drone, I would say, yeah, that's fantastic. If you have a 50,000-acre site, I would say, you know what, drone photogrammetry is probably the wrong approach for you. Use traditional aerial photogrammetry. Same thing with things like foliage, tree cover. Drones, contrary to what many people often believe when they're not experienced, drones are not X-ray vehicles. They can't see through tree cover. So managing things like tree cover and building eaves and making sure you know what you're trying to get and that it's visible from the air. Is it legal to fly here? Checking your Part 107 restrictions on every job site, making sure that the airspace is appropriate, that you're not right next to an airport. And then some more kind of operational questions as well. What altitude should I fly at? 100 feet, 200 feet, 400 feet. We'll go over that a little bit. What's the appropriate overlap? There's some trade-offs there. Higher overlap leads to often better data, but that means more field time, more processing time, sometimes can lead to some erroneous matches. How many ground control points should I set? That's probably one of the biggest questions that we hear. So we'll dive into that a lot too. Where should we set them? How to arrange the flight pattern? And also, what data still needs to be ground surveyed? That's another really important question as part of the mission planning process, because there are a couple of factors there. Not just what can and can't you see from the air, but also it's worth noting that every jurisdiction typically has its own regulations about certain types of data that must be surveyed on the ground. I know one common thing, do we have any registered or licensed land surveyors in the room? Got a few, perfect. Well, you can ask them, they'll probably know even better than me, but things like boundaries especially are often legally required to be surveyed on the ground. Actual monuments, walking the boundary line if you're doing an ALTA survey, things like that are going to be required on the ground. So very few surveys, at least in terms of like land surveying and civil engineering, can be done exclusively with drone photogrammetry. So it's part of a mixed workflow, and then you do some of it on the ground and work it all together in CAD at the end of the day. So why do we care about mission planning? Why can't I just go out and say, hey, I found an app on my phone that said mission planning easy, draw a square, hit go, we're off to the races. First off is that you want to save field time. If you don't do your mission planning right, you're going to spend a ton of time setting ground control points, or possibly worse, not enough time setting ground control points, and you'll have to go back into the field to shoot more or survey it on the ground. Less time surveying on the ground as well, because you know what you are and aren't going to get in the field, as well as shorter flight times too. So for larger sites, I mean, 15 minutes might not sound like much for a drone flight. Once you get to an hour in the air, plus battery changes and everything, it gets real boring once you hit go and just watch the drone buzz around. I always feel bad.
Everybody always takes their phone and like videos that part. It's off, right?
I had one project with a client once. They were really excited that they were seeing a drone surveying for the first time. They were so excited they actually brought their kids, their family, out to the job site. So there were like 4 kids there, and they're like, "We're going to see a drone survey." I'm like, oh man, dude, you're going to be so disappointed by this. And so they're so excited, they're looking. I hit the go button, and for the first like 5 seconds, they're like, "Wow, propellers!" And then it just disappears. It's like, all right, now sit and watch nothing for 20 minutes. You're going to have a great time. But the data was great, so the client was happy. Kids were a little bored. But saving field time is a big part about mission planning, but so is saving office time. A lot of the decisions that you make in the field will have a very big impact on the amount of time it takes to process the data in the office as well. For anyone that already has a Pix4D license and is heavy users of Pix4D knows that the difference between a 500 photo job and a 1,000 photo job in terms of compute time is quite significant. Mission planning will also get you better accuracy in the field, fewer errors in photogrammetry if you plan your mission appropriately, and it can allow for a simpler drafting workflow by oftentimes minimizing file sizes to make the processing and post-processing a lot faster. Just simpler workflows, faster workflows, keep everyone happy through every step of the process. So let's go into some of the actual nitty-gritty now. What are some of the clear recommendations that we have for flight planning? First off, lawnmower flight path. Single time, back and forth, not crosshatch. The reason we say that is for most surveying purposes, even when you're doing topographic planning, this is actually more than enough data to get high quality accuracy. A lot of apps will recommend flying, first north and south, and then again east and west. But we've done a ton of testing to ASPRS standards, and that actually does not improve your quality as long as your overlap is sufficient. But it will dramatically increase the amount of processing time because you're taking twice as many photos. Now, there are some circumstances where crosshatch flight pattern actually matters. If you want to map the facades of buildings and you're in a heavily urbanized environment, for example, then that crosshatch will allow for a lot more imagery on the faces of buildings. So that's an example of the flight pattern where the crosshatch pattern might make sense. But typically for land surveying, even with 3D land surveying where you need accurate topographic data, the lawnmower flight path has been proven to be exactly as good as crosshatch with less field time and less office time, as I was talking about before. 75-75 overlap, same thing. That's kind of been the Goldilocks number for us. There are a few exceptions with that. In fact, I'd say a lot of projects can actually get away with somewhat less overlap, but depending on changes in elevation, additional tree cover, 75-75 is sufficient. For areas where there is really dense tree cover, you might want to bump it up to 80-80 or something along those lines. But I'd say about 95% of projects, that 75-75 we found is a good number.
What about a gimbalized payload? Do you need it?
Oh, do you need a gimbal payload? Gimbal payloads are highly recommended, but not required. I'm assuming you're flying like a fixed wing, like an EB or something, or maybe one of the older multi-rotors.
I'm saying even just with quadcopter, pitch forward, you don't need exactly nadir.
It does, correct. It doesn't need to be exactly nadir. This a lot of this has to do with saving time too. So if you're 5 degrees off nadir, no, that's not going to cause any significant problems. Once you start to get 10, 15 degrees off nadir and then a little bit further, you actually get a couple of issues. One is the area that's further away from the ground, from the angle. You actually have a lower ground sampling distance there. It's closer when it's nearer to the camera, it's lower further away. So that actually lowers your overall average project ground sampling distance, which then lowers your accuracy. And the other thing is when you have nadir imagery, to get appropriate overlap, you often have to expand your flight area, fly more flight lines, higher overlap, which goes back to dramatically increasing the amount of photos that are actually involved in the workflow. So yeah, we say nadir only, but slightly off nadir isn't going to cause any problems, certainly. That's mostly about a office processing efficiency standpoint.
Can I say one thing, actually?
Yeah.
So there's I would say a misuse of terminology in a lot of the apps out there, where they say this is called a 2D flight or a 2D mission, and then they got the crosshatch or the double grid, whichever way you want to call it, but what Logan's talking about, and then they'll call that a 3D mission. They're both 3D missions, okay? So this will produce 3D data all day long. It's just about how much redundancy you want, and for the purpose of surveying and mapping, Logan's absolutely right that single pass will do you just fine.
Yep.
So don't be misled if you open up the app and it says 2D mission, and you're thinking, oh, I need a point cloud and I need topography and yada yada. It's okay. This will work.
Yep, that's exactly right. And like I said, that kind of 2D, 3D misnomer, the 3D is great for those really dense urban environments where you have a lot of like nooks and crannies to look into, and where you actually want like a good 3D model of a building facade. So I know people that are designing that want to do reality capture and then import it into a 3D model for use in a video game or something like that. You actually want better imagery on the facades of buildings, in which case, yeah, sure, go 3D imagery and go off nadir as well. That's going to be great. But for actual surveying and mapping purposes, you're very rarely surveying the facades of the buildings and underneath the eaves of the building. If you do need to survey and map underneath the eaves of buildings, well, one, this is a pretty tough workflow to do, but yeah, that's when you use that kind of 3D workflow. Yeah?
Does flight direction, is there a role point for the flight direction?
Typically, we haven't found any impact in accuracy, no. We usually use wind as the biggest driver in what the flight direction is. Excuse me. For fixed wings, wind has an enormous impact in terms of flight planning. For multi-rotors, it's a lot less, but typically, you know, kind of moving perpendicular to the wind makes it a little easier, but not a huge difference. So another thing on this note, as I was really alluding to earlier, there is such a thing as too much data. People say like, hey, get more data. That's, you know, there's no downside to it, right? Wrong. There's absolutely such a thing as too much data. That is because manpower is not free, computer power is not free, software is not free, processing time is not free, and data analysis and errors and troubleshooting is not free. All of those things cost time and money. And if you throw more data at a problem, then oftentimes you have more problems that you have to fix. Any mistake, I mean, any extra processing in Pix4D, if you have to rerun a project just to integrate an additional ground point, maybe you marked a checkpoint wrong, maybe you wanted to change the calibration information about the camera, all of that takes a lot more time when you are throwing a lot more data at the problem. So for us, when creating an efficient workflow, a workflow that you actually want to be repeatable, that you want to use on multiple projects, that you want to be more than just a science fair project, then you want to optimize the amount of data that you get. And that saves you time in the field, saves you processing time, it makes your files smaller too. For anyone that does use CAD programs a lot, you often know, especially with Civil 3D, putting a 10 gigabyte point cloud directly into Civil 3D without any sort of intermediate step is going to be very, very, very difficult. There are a handful of workarounds, but then you have to use workarounds, and even then it can kind of cause problems. And also possible erroneous matches. If you have too many photos located from the exact same or very, very similar geolocation, they can actually create erroneous matches in the photogrammetry matching algorithm as well. So solutions, step one is actually fly higher. That's a little counterintuitive to most people. But in general, you want to fly as high as you can for the accuracy that you need for a certain project. That means, and I'll go into the exact tables of how this works, but the higher you fly, the fewer ground control points that you actually have to set, because there's fewer interpolations between photos. And the lower the flight time, and the lower all of the file sizes. If you fly too low without setting enough ground control points, you're going to get really inaccurate data in between those ground control points. So the lower you fly, the more ground control points you have to set. As discussed, lawnmower, not crosshatch, and also no overlap overkill. Sometimes I've seen plenty of people test like, hey, what if I do 90-90 overlap, just to see it as a test and see if that's accurate. Well, if you back that up a little bit, kind of inverse of 90%, 1 out of 10, that means each photo going forward, a single point will be in 10 photos going forward. And it will also be that same point in 10 photos going side to side. That means every individual point, if you're at 90-90 overlap, will be in 100 images. That's overkill. If you looked in the old days of photogrammetry, two images, stereo imagery, was enough to actually get accurate data. Now it's like, hey, let's do 100 points, or 100 images for a single point. Way too much data. That's why we kind of go back that 75, 75. What that winds up being is about 16 matches per point in like flat land. But that's really kind of the optimal data for these for Pix4D algorithms as well. So let's go through some actual examples here. Here are a couple of actual projects that our clients submitted to us. As we said, Aerotas, we actually process client data, and sometimes we have to reject client data too, and we've pissed a few people off that way when we don't process their data. But here's some examples in Pix4D of what some of the projects look like. So here on the left, we've got a project with, number one, it's crosshatch, which, you know, it'll be a pain processing it in terms of time, but it still will actually get you good data. That's not going to be a piss of death. But what we see are the ground control points clustered in the center right here. And they wanted us to do survey and line work drafting on the whole project, all the way through these outer edges. And we said, no, we're not going to do that. This is really, this kind of area right here is only where it gets accurate data. And as you go 1, 2 flight lines out, it's going to start getting less and less and less accurate. We've done a few case studies to try and exactly measure, okay, how far away from ground control points can you actually get before it starts getting inaccurate? And unfortunately, we haven't figured out a consistent formula for this is how far you can go. But we've come up with some rule of thumbs on a lot of these things, is no more than half an image width outside of the photo, or of the ground control point. So if this is where the ground control point is, you can probably get to kind of about somewhere in this area before you start seeing the accuracy drop off. It's just a rule of thumb, it's project dependent. In general, we recommend testing, setting checkpoints if there's ever any concern, going out and field testing things. So that's one project. This was another project, just an example of someone that, quite frankly, had no idea what they're doing, so they just flew like 16 different flights and said more data will fix the problem. Sure enough, they had horrendously insufficient ground control. I don't think there's any ground control marked on here at all, because they had like one up here and one down here. And we just said, no, that's not survey grade. It's fine for an image. If you just want like an ortho image that you can use to back up existing drawings, sure, we can do that. But, you know, heck, that's not the point of what we're trying to do here. We're trying to get you accurate 3D data. So just an example of throwing more data, more flights, more overlap. Doesn't solve problems. If there are inherent problems in the data, they are going to persist through more data. And they'll make it harder to discover a lot of those problems. Here's another example to show of what kind of the interplay between ground control and overlap. They thought, hey, I want to survey this area, I want it to be super accurate, so I'm going to throw a whole bunch more photos at it. But the big problem here is when you have this chunk here and this chunk here, this area gets so narrow here that this one effectively processes as an entirely separate block. And it leaves the ability to kind of wiggle it around in 3D space, even though there's a connection here, another ground control point there. That means you're effectively trying to process a project with only 3 ground control points, which is geometrically the absolute bare minimum needed for triangulation, and typically not enough to actually ensure good accuracy on the project. So good rule of thumb with ground control points as well is a minimum of 5 ground control points in any one project. But being able to spot kind of issues like this that are going to be effectively its own block. It's effectively an island when it gets down to something like this. Now if they had actually flown a flight pattern that had some photos over here that would then allow Pix4D to interpolate properly between these segments, then you could get away with a couple fewer ground control points. But either way, it goes back to that same thing. They should have done less overlap, no crosshatch flight pattern, spent that time setting just a few more ground control points, and they would have walked away with a lot better data than they have here. Another one, same issue as before, not enough overlap, not enough ground control points, no crosshatching here, but once you get these kind of single flight lines, those are effectively islands. They are processing by themselves. They need their own set of ground control points. This was just a poorly concocted flight plan that, again, we just had to reject the processing on this. You can get data out of it. You can actually get imagery data that looks fine out of it. But for actually getting verifiable and certifiable survey-grade accuracy that any sort of professional is actually going to want, this is absolutely, totally insufficient for that type of data. So the next thing I want to talk about is high relief projects too. Some autopilots have the ability to track terrain now, which is awesome, and if you can use that, great, because it creates a consistent ground sampling distance. But a lot of autopilots don't, and that's not always a problem, as long as you kind of know what the impact is. So here is kind of a profile view of the point cloud. You've got the photos here. Each one of these things are going to be the ground control points, and yeah, the photos up on the top. Now, some of the issues with this are that ground sampling distance, your resolution is obviously going to be lower here because it's further away from the camera, higher here, that's fine. But it also means, because of the way that the geometry works out, overlap is going to be sufficient here, and it's probably going to be overkill overlap here. And in fact, we see some of the artifacts here. A lot of these kind of rogue points in the point cloud are going to be erroneous matches because there's so much overlap that the algorithm actually saw that there were matches when there weren't because the photos were bundled very, very closely together. That said, this is typically not going to be a problem for surveying as long as you understand that accuracy up here is going to be high, accuracy up here is going to be slightly lower than it is up at the top. So that's kind of what some of the basics of mission planning look like, but now let's dive more specifically into ground control points and checkpoints. So first off is how many ground control points, and as we talked about, what flight altitude do you want to fly? Here's some approximate accuracy expectations for project planning. Now this, I should put the caveat on the slide actually, this assumes a DJI Phantom 4 Pro, one of the most popular drones out there, that is also very, very good for drone photogrammetry. All of this data is totally dependent on what drone you use. If you have a drone that has a higher resolution metric camera, then it's going to be totally, totally different. If you try and fly with a GoPro duct taped to your kid's Christmas present, then, well, you probably shouldn't be in this room at all, but you're also going to have a different table. So what is your expected accuracy when you do this? These are all, for us, we work with surveyors who all speak in tenths of feet, so everything that we report is going to be in tenths of feet. Typically what we say, when you fly at 100 feet altitude, you can get about a tenth of a foot vertical and a little bit better than a tenth of a foot horizontal accuracy. The higher you fly, the lower RMSE accuracy you are going to get. We do use RMSE when we talk about accuracy, not, hey, I checked 3 points and they all looked good, so that's what I'm going to say. We actually use a statistical measure. We often find that a lot of people do confuse in their reporting standards ground sampling distance with accuracy, and even when they say accuracy, they might say we tested 90 or 50% were within some small interval, and that can often be misleading. So we actually use RMSE according to the ASPRS positional accuracy standards. So to get to this, to get these accuracies, what do you actually need? Ground control. And the approximate amount of ground control you need changes with flight altitude. So what you can see here is if you're flying at 100 feet with 5 targets, you can cover about 5 acres or so. If you're flying at 200 feet, those same 5 targets will let you cover 20 acres. And if you're flying at 400 feet, those same 5 targets will let you cover 50 acres. And that's because the way that ground control really works is you need a fixed amount of ground control depending on the number of photos that you have, not the amount of area that you cover necessarily. So this, from our experience, is what it takes to get to sufficient accuracy, again, with the DJI Phantom 4 Pro with its 20 megapixel global shutter camera. Caveats apply if you're flying a different drone. But the big key takeaway from this is, okay, so if you were flying a 50-acre site and say you needed 1 foot topo over the whole thing, very common requirement, how many ground control points should you set? Well, it depends on your flight altitude. So if you're doing your 50 acres, you fly at 400 feet, easy, you set 5 ground control points. That might take, even with driving around a 50-acre site, then it might take, maybe an hour. Now if you said, oh, I want higher accuracy, so I'm going to fly lower, I'm going to fly at 100 feet. Well, then all of a sudden, it's 5 targets per 5 acres. Now instead of setting 5 ground control points, you have to set 50 ground control points. You have to set 10 times as many ground control points. And you are spending a ton of time in the field. And you're killing your efficiency on that. And this is what I mean when I say lower is not always better, fly higher where you can, and also there is such a thing as too much data. If you were to set only 5 targets on a 50-acre site and then fly it at 100 feet, your accuracy, you would be off by 2 feet in some cases, where it actually starts interpolating far between the photos. You're seeing really, really huge, wild swings between the photos just because it has to step so many photos one to the next in between ground control points. So when you're flying and when you're mission planning, you need to make sure that you accurately balance the flight altitude, the number of photos that you're going to take, with the number of ground control points you set. Another just kind of rule of thumb-ish way to do this is, for the Phantom 4 Pro at least, we like to say 5 targets per flight battery. That's approximately what this comes out to. Or 5 targets per 300 to 400 photos. They wind up being about the same thing in most scenarios. Any questions on ground control, setting targets, that sort of thing? Cool. So 5 targets per battery, that's kind of what we said. This is what, at least for a rectangular site, a good flight or a good ground control point layout looks like. This is, 150, 200 photos, 5 ground control points, some in the corners, 1 in the center, fly a little bit outside of each ground control point, obvious center point, visible from all angles. When I talk about, that interpolation too, you can kind of count the number of flight lines. It's only about 4 or 5 flight lines between ground control points. Once you start to fly more, if you're flying lower, those flight lines are closer together. You see 20 flight lines below. That's where you kind of get that wiggle in the project, and you get lower accuracy data. This is an example of insufficient poor ground control point distribution here. A couple of things going on in this one. One really wonky flight pattern. I don't know why they flew it twice, but not even 90 degrees crosshatch, but whatever. Again, that just means it's costing them more time in the field, which sucks, but still could process it. The real issue is that a lot of these ground control points are outside of the outer edge of the project, which leads to bad accuracy. Photogrammetry relies on triangulation. Triangulation requires seeing it from multiple angles, ideally from as far separate angles on the outside as you possibly can. These will still process, but oftentimes will give lower quality accuracy. Also, we have a lot fewer ground control points in the center, which means the data along this road is probably going to be pretty darn good. It's actually not going to be terrible up here, but right in the center, there's going to be a lot of flexibility. I don't know exactly what it was on this project, because we didn't ground truth it, but my guess is you're going to see probably at least half a foot of additional noise in there. And that noise could be either direction, but it's also probably going to be highly correlated that the whole project is likely to be about half a foot too high or half a foot too low, and the only way to know it is actually to shoot it on the ground, so that's why there's going to be error with it. But it's common, especially with kind of middling drone photogrammetry like the DJI drones, to see that sort of doming just caused by improper calibration and insufficient ground control points and that sort of thing. This is what that kind of corner process actually looks like too out in the field or in the Pix4D ray cloud here, is when you have the photo that is outside, or the ground control point outside of the outer edge, you can see it's only visible from these 3 photos and only from that outer angle, which means you're going to get a lot of error in there, especially in the vertical side of things. As far as measuring accuracy, vertical is always more of a pain in the ass than horizontal accuracy. Horizontal is always going to be tighter. That's just kind of physics being annoying. But yeah, that's where there will be accuracy. And again, adding more data at this doesn't solve the problem. Just because we have 2 ground control points here, and they're 2 crappy ground control points, that doesn't make it better. If I had 5 times as many photos bunched up here as well, and even though you could see it from now, 20 photos, but they're all from this angle, that doesn't make it any better. You're still going to have the same error if your mission planning is wrong. So more data does not fix existing errors that are already there in your mission planning and in your ground control process.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So on the example on the left, you get this data and you realize there's not enough control and it's not placed in the right place.
Yep.
Where, you got corners. I'm seeing really big gaps in between where the control points exist. So
Okay.
yeah, and if you kind of draw a line from the center to any one of those corners.
Yeah.
Now, would it improve the solution if you added more? This is post. We're being hypothetical here, but post project is collected. If you went back and you shot more control, let's say in where those gaps exist, and then you could, pre-process with extra control, what's that going to do?
Yeah, that'll absolutely tighten up the project. In fact, if we were to receive projects like either of these from the clients, we typically give them, one of three options. One is accept low accuracy. No one likes that typically, but accept like, hey, if we gave you this project, we'd actually send it with a caveat saying something along the lines of, hey, just so you know, we know you wanted 0.2 of a foot vertical accuracy on this, but we probably wouldn't be comfortable even saying it's going to be that much more than about a foot accuracy in this sort of area. So you can either accept it as is, but you've got a couple of other options too. One is go out and shoot more control. If you go out and shoot control, same thing with this one too. We'd say, hey, go out, find a visual ID point here. Shoot a visual ID point as a control, get that back to us. We can integrate it into the project, reprocess it, and then go from there, and that'll tighten up your accuracy. So when we deliver a project like this, we'll say, hey, you're expecting 1 foot accuracy. If he says, nah, I needed 0.3, then it's go out and shoot more points. If he says, it's really rough topo, 1 foot's fine, great, process it and go from there. And then the third option is obviously just don't process it at all, just kind of throw it away. A lot of times when clients do this, it's a message that we hate delivering, but like, this is not the accuracy that you wanted, there is nothing we can do with it. It's like, all right, throw it away, we'll go and shoot it on the ground. And a lot of, heck, that's a better answer than delivering that data to your clients. Because that's how you end up in court or someone with a really, really bad bill. And I wish I could say that those are all hypothetical situations too, but those are things that we actually see every single day too. A lot of people that don't actually go out to an ASPRS scientist for something like this, and maybe we've seen people go out and hire someone on the internet for $50 with a drone to do a survey, and then they get back the data and they'll even submit it. Hell, maybe they won't even QA/QC it, which is just ridiculous in my mind that a surveyor will actually take data from someone for $50 without QA/QC. Submit it, and then they'll give the surface to an earth moving company. They'll move, a couple hundred dump trucks worth of earth, and then at the end of the day, they'll say, "Whoa, we're missing like 50,000 metric tons of dirt here that we were expecting there to be." And you can go back, and sure enough, they're just dumb photogrammetry errors because they hired someone that doesn't know what they're doing. They don't know how to measure accuracy. When they say accuracy, heck, maybe they used on the Pix4D quality report, it measures RMS accuracy of ground control points, which is can be a good indicator of errors further down the project, but just because that one's green doesn't mean that the project is perfectly accurate. You gotta go independent checkpoints too. So yeah, these are all just real world examples of how not having good mission planning leads to bad data and can ultimately lead to problems down the line. But that's why we do things like this, right? Good mission planning and measuring accuracy means that it's not a crapshoot. This isn't just some random like, hey, I'm going to survey and hope that it all works. With good mission planning and procedures, it's super, super reliable. It's going to work right. It's going to work right every single time. And even in the case that it doesn't, you're going to know right away that it doesn't. So let's talk about some bad targets too. We see just having ground control is a good start, but there are also some examples of good and bad targets. First off, these are some examples of bad targets. That one, just a pure white box or square. Sometimes people use bucket lids. Typically, you can't find the center perfectly. It's good, but not quite good enough. It's better than nothing, but if you really want to get down to a 10th or better than a 10th accuracy, it's typically not going to be good. These are another one, concrete corners, things like that. Difficult to identify, and especially bad from a workflow perspective. Your photogrammetrist is going to hate you because if you just say corner of concrete, when he's first looking at this, he doesn't know if that corner, or that corner, or that corner, or that corner is going to be the actual ground control point. It's a lot harder to pick out. Usually you can figure that side of it out, but it takes a lot more time, more processing. One of those many, many compounding, just time pains that can happen things. Chevrons are a weird one. We've done a couple thousand projects and see a lot of chevrons. There's no consensus from what we've seen of even where in a chevron to mark. I have seen it marked in the front tip, the center, and the back corner as well. And I've actually seen a project with 2 different field crews where half the chevrons were marked on the forward tip and half of them were marked on the inside corner. Someone needs better procedures with their own surveying crews, but the fact is it adds for errors and that sort of thing. And this is my favorite. I just really love that there is someone that actually brought about a dozen targets out to the field with nails and put them right in the center of mass, because that's where you That's where the drone needs to get. That said, not recommended. These are our recommended targets. These are just vinyl kitchen tiles, but really it's that pattern that we like. Quite frankly, anything that is high contrast that leads to a clear center point is going to work fine, but that's just a good pattern for targets. Targets are just one of those numerous things, like everything else that I've been talking about, that if you get them right, it's not going to perfectly make your project good, but each one of these steps reduces compounding error. There are hundreds and hundreds of sources of error, and you want to reduce as many as possible to get to the highest quality end product. So here's another just kind of interesting project as we talk about some of the unexpected sources of error. So this looks like, we haven't put a flight plan over it, but let's assume that you fly high enough and that the formula I said before says that 5 ground control points is enough. There's still a problem here. And the problem, if anyone else can see it, is this big water body in the middle. Water, as you know from photogrammetry, is impossible to stitch. It's impossible to recreate perfectly. What that winds up meaning is that these two, unless there's really, really good overlap, but it doesn't look like there will be just because of how wide this is, these are going to process in 2 totally separate blocks. Or even more dangerously, they might have a single photo overlap or something at the top so that the quality report will say that it processed in 1 block, but it's effectively 2 separate blocks. Which means all of this data with only 2 is not enough ground control points at all, and especially this is going to be wildly inaccurate, many, many feet inaccurate. And same thing over here with 3, likely going to be really, really bad. So that's just another thing to be aware of when planning missions, that be aware of the geometry of the site, because that impacts the number and distribution of ground control points that you actually need to set. Now, one of the biggest advances in the last, couple of months has been the announcement of the Phantom 4 RTK drone, which is a really, really great piece of equipment. It's not the first RTK drone out there. There are numerous others out there. In our opinion, it's the cleanest workflow and easiest to use to date. Still a little bit more complicated than typical photogrammetry workflow. But the data quality we've been seeing out of it is really, really killer. Now, RTK, of course, means that you have dual band photogrammetry, or dual band GPS on the aircraft itself. You can either process it in real time or in post-processing back in the office. And what it promises is centimeter or thereabouts precision of the aircraft itself when it is flying. And honestly, it's actually lived up to that in our testing. But control and check data is still required to get ASPRS certification, to certify your accuracy. And there are a couple of reasons behind that. One is that there are still many sources of error. Even, let's just assume that RTK works perfectly every single time. It doesn't. But let's assume for a second it does. Even then, there's still a lot of sources of error between where the drone is and then a point in a point cloud 3D model after it's been processed. There could be lens calibration errors. There could be, there could be an issue with the RTK. There could be different amounts of movement, and there could be processing errors. There's so much stuff that could go on. You actually need ground data and checkpoints to make sure that your data is still accurate. Another common error is screwing up the datums that you're working in, whether it's the vertical datum or the horizontal datum, and actually managing any sort of coordinate system translation is an enormously complex process that is that's subject to tons and tons of human error. Pix4D actually does a really great job of coordinate system translation, with the exception of vertical datums with multiple geoids. But it's a source that needs to be checked, and that's part of why you need ground data checks. And the ASPRS positional accuracy standards reflect that as well. So both because it is good practice and because it is required, even with an RTK system, you do still need some level of ground data. It's a lot less. You don't need 5 per flight anymore. In fact, you can get away with 3 or 4 over an entire project if that's what makes you comfortable. ASPRS certification would still require 20, but if you just set a few as independent checkpoints to verify a project, then that's good. But the fact is, RTK, it's great, we love it, it actually is living up to its promises, it is really good quality data, but the promise of fly a drone and get a survey without ever touching boots on the ground, that's not there yet. You do still need some level of ground data verification, especially when you're doing any sort of surveying or engineering application.
Can you get away with less overlap?
In our experience, no.
No.
Some people have said that. To be honest, we haven't tested that very extensively yet. The problem with less overlap in general is it's typically fine until it isn't. If you start with 75 and then 75, then go to 70, 70, it's typically fine. And then you go to 65, 65, it's typically fine. Maybe then you go to 64, 64, and then it doesn't go, oh, now I'm a little lower accuracy project. It's just crap altogether then. It'll have like a whole block that doesn't process. There'll be the tip of a hill that doesn't have enough overlap, and it just completely falls off a cliff. That's the problem with low overlap. It's not that you get this kind of nice smooth curve where the less overlap, the less accuracy. It's kind of fine, 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 worthless. So the RTK data wouldn't have that much of an impact there because it's really about the matching algorithms more so than it is about actually getting good accuracy.
And you always do the same overlap?
95% of the time.
I mean, in vertical and horizontal. I mean, in forward and side.
Yeah, we do. I know different people have different preferences to that. To be honest, that's a little bit more of an art than a science. Depending on the exact shape of your image sensor, a lot of kind of metric cameras are going to have a perfectly square image sensor. A few drones will have 16:9. Most, like the Phantom series, are going to be 4:3. That actually, it all kind of has its own impact. 75/75 is our recommendation. If you want to fly 70/75, yeah, by all means.
You were talking about having good like horizontal spatial distribution of your ground control points. But
Yeah.
What about the vertical distribution of them, like building tops? You know, like do you want to have them all on the ground, or if the project's not exactly all about on the ground?
Great question. You want to have it evenly distributed to the best of your abilities, but there are some points where it doesn't matter. If you're flying at 200-foot altitude and your total project has 20 foot of vertical relief from the top of a building to the bottom of a trough somewhere, then that typically is not going to require you to climb and get roof access to a building and put something on there. If you're on a major slope and there's 100-foot elevation change in the project, then yeah, you're going to want to get a ground control point on the higher elevation point if you can. Ground control, kind of like I was saying with overlap, but even more so, ground control point placement itself is very much more of an art than a science. Another thing that's actually reflected in the positional accuracy standards, there is no advice for exactly where you set ground control points because it's different project to project. So my advice and what I tell the clients when it's where do I set ground control points in areas with significant vertical relief, if practical, yeah, have some on high elevation and some on low elevation wherever practical. The more elevation change there is, the more of a need there is to actually have your ground control points very vertically as well. If you want to survey the top of a building, you can't get to the top of a building, you're probably going to be okay actually, especially if it's up to 3 or 4 or 5 stories even. But it's possible that the tops of those buildings are going to be just slightly less accurate than everything else. The only way to truly know all of this stuff is to test it. So that's just another good kind of rule of thumb is always test this stuff. Whenever I'm asked, we deliver data, we deliver a final survey to some of our clients, and they say, well, this is great, but how do I know I can trust you? My answer is typically, don't trust me. Check it. When you send us ground control point, checkpoint data, hold a few back. That's the responsible thing to do with this type of thing. Even from your own photogrammetrists, have your field crews and your CAD techs hold back a couple of points from the photogrammetrists themselves, so they can't get a little sneaky and say, I'm just gonna throw this extra checkpoint in there and call it a checkpoint just to make sure that my model's right. That's not how you get verifiably accurate data. So holding data back, checking that sort of thing is really the only way to know and make sure that everything's accurate. Yeah.
What's the difference between a GCP and a checkpoint?
Oh, great question. I think I go over this in a later slide, but just in case I don't, I'll talk about it here. Ground control points are used in the production of the model itself. So they actually are integrated. The data is given to the photogrammetry process early on. And Jeff, can you go over that a little bit too when you're going through the live demo?
Of course.
GCP's
yes,
checkpoints.
Of course.
And checkpoints are held back. They are not used to create the model. They're used to measure, okay, so I measured this on the ground and I have my 3D model. How far apart are they? So it's totally independent. It's independently measured, and it's used to see if the model itself is accurate.
Just like ground, so just like quality assurance.
Yeah, exactly. It's a QA/QC point, basically.
Hey, I'm not sure if you're going to go into this later on, but you're saying for RTK data, you would need checkpoints to be able to trust the results at all.
Yes.
But for a kind of non-RTK data where you're just using, like say 5 GCPs, you wouldn't need checkpoints, or would you still need checkpoints to be able to give it a seal of?
We would still very, very strongly recommend checkpoints. The difference is when you're using just ground control points, you do already have a level of verification by making sure that the ground control points are where they say they are. So you're kind of checking them against, you have what the drone says and then what the ground control points say. Checkpoints are better though. And there's a difference in the ASPRS positional accuracy standards that when you're testing something that says whether a project has been produced to meet, which means you've gone through the process that implies that your accuracy is going to be good enough, and tested to meet. And you can only, that tested to meet is a higher standard of accuracy, and you can only claim that a project has been tested to meet the standards when you use independent checkpoints.
So what was the first one called? That looks good to me or something?
Yeah, produced to meet.
Produced to me. So that means that from everything you can see, it looks like it should be accurate.
Exactly. It means I have gone through this process numerous times in the past. I have tested this process numerous times in the past, and in the past it has given me accuracy of this level. While I have not tested it this time, I've gone through the same process, so I have every reason to believe that it's of that level of accuracy. That's kind of
so much experience doing this kind of work.
Exactly. Yep.
So maybe the RTK, when it becomes a bit more mature, that you can say, I've done 1,000 RTK maps, so I know that
exactly
that might meet the same standards.
And we're hopeful for that. We're very, very hopeful that RTK will get to that standard. Quite frankly though, right now with RTK, the incidence of just human blunders, like just fat fingering something, converting something wrong, a point getting GPS multipathing error, has been so prevalent somewhere in the process that not having any check on that kind of last step is reckless, quite frankly. And again, it's not because the satellite all of a sudden jumped up 10 feet and you didn't know it. It's because of those things. Coordinate system translations are far and away the most common issue for actually getting these vertical errors wrong with RTK data, and managing your coordinate systems and datums properly. And just having having that much room for human error and not having any sort of data validation at the end of the process, it's not going to pass muster for most surveying and engineering applications. Again, it might. As the technology matures, there's all kinds of possibilities. Heck, I'm sure if I gave this presentation a year from today, a whole bunch of things are going to be different about required number of ground control points, camera calibration, yada, yada, yada. So with that, collecting field data, as I talked about earlier, collecting field data is kind of stupid simple, draw square, push button. Once you get your mission planning side of things right, it's very easy. Our rule of thumb is just have SOPs, standard operating procedures. For us, that means checklists. We like checklists not because they teach you something that you don't know, but just remind you to go through things in the right order. So project planning, setting your ground control point, setting your autopilot, inspecting your aircraft, mission execution, emergency procedures, flight logging, pretty basic stuff. Like I said, we have codified SOPs on flight operations in a checklist. If you want any of these checklists, these are available on our website, aerotas.com, or you can come drop me a card. We give away our checklists for free. If anyone wants just field checklists that they can use or copy or something like that for their missions. But yeah, something that's comprehensive, easy to follow, and just making it mandatory. I always say I use these all the time, even though I've been flying drones for surveying now for 5+ years. I use them on every single flight, not because I have no idea what I'm doing, but because I have forgotten the stupid things before. And there's nothing in the world more frustrating than having to go back to the field and revisit a project site because you forgot to put the memory card in your drone. Hooray, you go through all this time getting certified, 6 years to become a certified photogrammetrist, and you can't remember to put the memory card in your drone, dummy. I've done that way too many times. So yeah, that's why we like using checklists. It kind of goes back to that, save time and money, and gosh, it's about the little things. It's so often about the little things in life, right? Like all of those little things that wind up ruining something that you spend so much time and money on, and the stupid little tiny micro SD card just killed an entire day. Sorry, I triggered myself on this one just because it's bad memories. So a typical field operations workflows starts with just checking for site restrictions, airspace instructions, TFRs. I mean, the FAA sent out a thing today about, hey, don't fly in Atlanta near the Super Bowl. The whole city of Atlanta is off limits for drone flights for 3 days because of that. You know, things like that. We're based out of California. We get wildfires. You really don't want to mess around with firefighting efforts. That's important. Checking weather forecasts, creating and saving your flight plans, equipment packing checklist, aircraft inspection. All of this stuff is on our checklist as well and should be on yours. Then going out, surveying your ground data, GCPs and checkpoints, obstructed areas, whether that's under dense vegetation, under building corners, as well as stuff that must be surveyed on the ground, so property corners, survey monuments, that sort of thing. Check your emergency procedures, make sure you know what's going to happen if a busload of children comes out and starts running around the site, whatever. Loading your mission, running an operation, and then data handling procedures too. Once you have 1,000 photos on your that tiny little SD memory card that has way too much value for such a small little piece of plastic, what are you going to do with it to make sure that you don't lose it? That you actually make appropriate copies? How are you going to transmit it? It's going to be many gigabytes of data typically. Do you have just some level of procedure? They don't even have to be good procedures, as long as they're just codified so that you do it the same thing every time. When you bring it back to the office, first you upload it to this, then you upload it to this site, and then you ship it off to Greg in accounting so that he can delete all the files and put it back in the box, whatever. Having just good standard operating procedures for all of that makes it a good workflow, and more importantly, makes it a reliable and repeatable workflow. Again, it's all about saving field revisits, saving time, that sort of stuff. So I'll just go through a quick example, and then I'll hand it off to Jeff to actually pull up some one of the live Pix4D projects that they've done on this sort of data. So this is one example, construction site project planning. This was located in Nevada, 145 acres that they were going to turn into a subdivision, building houses. A couple of limitations, it's big, so some line of sight limitations. GCPs were hard to get in certain areas. Accuracy specs, not particularly high accuracy. They wanted to do 1 foot contours, and in order to be confident in their 1 foot contours, they wanted a half foot vertical root mean squared error of independent checkpoints. So set flight altitude of 400 feet, as we talked about before. Lower is not always better when you need more accuracy. 400 feet, more than sufficient, for a half foot RMSE. And when you're planning that out with our 75-75 overlap, that means about 45 minutes of flight time, take 3 flight batteries, and we want to set 15 ground control points for that entire project. So we do our quick plan in Google Earth. You know, realistically, it can kind of look intense like this, but probably spent about 5 minutes just like dropping this on a KML file and then sending it to the field crew. There's your flight plan, set up like that. You know, a little bit outside of line of sight, but oh well, that's not the end of the world. It's not like there's anyone else flying around in this desert area. And then this is what the final project for us looks like, the actual final deliverable. And again, once Jeff goes through the kind of Pix4D data processing side of things, I'll walk through how do you get then from Pix4D, and then obviously this imagery is the ortho photo from Pix, all the way to what you see there, clean contours. Clean, reliable, verifiable, accurate contours. So with that, we can actually dive into the photogrammetry workflow, and I will hand it to you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
And
Question.
is Maps Made Easy the best mission plan?
It's our favorite. Part of the reason we like that is it has a terrain tracking feature that'll actually follow.
Logan.
Sorry, there's also Pix4D Capture, which actually is, it honestly, Pix4D Capture is a great capture app as well. And it's also, that's on Android too, right?
Yes.
Capture, that's one of the big benefits. MapPilot's only on iOS, Pix4D is more widely available. And a little bit more stable, I'd say too. The only thing that we wanted to have is terrain tracking. Yeah. So, honestly, they're both fine. They both will capture good data. Yeah.
No drone deploy.
Drone deploy has been a little glitchy, but when it works fine. Yeah, we're not super married to one capture app over the other. Quite frankly, they all have pros and cons. MapPilot and PixCapture are going to be our 2 favorite. drone deploy, and I can list off 100 others like Altazur and DJI, GS Pro. There are a bunch of others. Typically, they'll all have one thing that makes them stand out and makes them special, and a few things that make them a pain. Really, if it gets good data, if it works for you, great, do it. My experience is MapPilot's good and Pix4D is really good too.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more thing to that. What we're talking about here, and I can explain this more when we kind of had an off to the side discussion. It doesn't matter ultimately what app is used to capture the data. And what I mean by that is when you take the photos post collection and then throw them into Pix4D to actually do processing. Pix4D, the processor itself, has no idea if there was MapPilot or Joe's flying app. Doesn't know, doesn't care. As long as we've lectured here, these fundamental rules of thumb and procedures are followed, like the overlap and those kind of best practices. So, hey, like you said, if you got something else that you like to fly, and it's got those, to me, features are the driving force, right?
Yeah.
Very much like what you said. If it doesn't have what I need, bye. I'm not going to use it.
That's
okay?
exactly right. And
So, because I don't have time to wait for a developer to come out with what I'm looking for. I'll just look somewhere else, and if I find it somewhere else, I'm good.
yeah, and like you're saying, I mean, Pix4D doesn't care. As long as the data's good, it flies. And quite frankly, we've had a couple of projects that were manually flown that actually worked. We had one client that was on the North Shore of Alaska in a GPS denied area, so he couldn't use any autopilot because there's no GPS. So there's no autopilot. He's like, I really need this data. I'm like, all right, man, you gotta fly it manually. That's gonna be tough, but you gotta do it. Like, try and the best you can, eyeball it, approximately what that is. He was a very experienced pilot, thankfully. And the data processed fine. It wasn't perfect. It was probably more data. I mean, the operations planning for that was a total mess because he was trying to plan it manually. So it was not perfect, but it actually worked fine. Really, I mean, Pix4D is about photogrammetry, and that's what they're just the best at. And whatever gets you the best data, use it.
I was curious, out of the 15 points that you had in the previous example, how many were ground control points and how many were checkpoints?
Great question.
And how do you decide where you put those checkpoints? Because I could imagine the error would be higher in like the ravine and
Yep.
maybe better.
Great question. These were all ground control points. So all of these were ground control points. And they also set, so approximately you want them evenly distributed throughout the project, with some on the outer edges and some in the center of the project as well. With the goal being to minimize the maximum distance between any kind of 2 points, the gaps between those ground control points. That's what you're trying to really minimize with this sort of thing. There's some areas when I look to a project site like this that, even heck, this area right here, I would have loved to put one extra ground control point in there. But because this project had lower accuracy tolerances, 1/2 foot vertical instead of maybe 2 or 3/10, then they were okay with that sort of thing. But that said, these are all ground control points approximately randomly distributed, subject to real world considerations of where you might have access to the site and where it's pretty difficult to access. As far as checkpoints, we have no idea. The client did set checkpoints, but they did what good data security actually says, and they didn't even tell us. They didn't tell us how many they set. They didn't tell us where they set them. We have no idea. That way we can't plan to make it look nice on the checkpoints. So the client did set checkpoints on this project. From knowing that client, they probably set right around 20, which is what kind of the minimum to certify a project is accurate. And they're not going to tell us. And that's exactly as it should be. If it absolutely needs to be certifiably correct, don't tell the photogrammetrist what the checkpoints are. That's the best way to do it. But yeah, another note, distribution of ground control points. Real world conditions do matter. You don't always have access to an entire site. Sometimes it is worth sacrificing a little bit of accuracy because of real world field considerations. I can't access this because there's, blackberry brambles and it would take me a month to hike the 2 miles in, whatever. So, yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Okay. One quick question.
Yeah.
We do forensic animation, so in the motor vehicle cases, we're scanning, terrestrial scanning. And typically it'd be around the area, so we'll have 600, 800 feet that we scan, and then we drone the rest.
Yep.
You know, but we don't use control points. Would you find that problematic?
Well, it depends on what you're using it for. What types of measurements do you need to extract out of the drone model? Or are you just using it as imagery to match up the rest?
Yeah.
If you're,
With a mosaic to map onto.
yeah, so if you're just using it as imagery to give context to something, then that's okay. Now, if you're actually performing measurements like measuring point A to point B, how much volume, that's when you really need ground control points. Just imagery for context to something, no need to use ground control points, none at all. That said, if you're scanning it, you actually have ground control points and you don't even know it.
But that's just in the center, off to the edges.
Yeah.
You know, 600 feet down and 600 feet down, we really have no scans.
That's area where you can make it. The imagery is going to be great, but I would call it low accuracy, or unreliable accuracy at least, so that you can use it perfectly fine. I have no problem with that whatsoever. I mean, one of the most popular kind of photogrammetry things out there is drone deploy. We don't like it because we're surveyors, but a lot of people use it, throw photos at it, and ta-da, you've got a pretty picture. And if all you need is a pretty picture, then sure, but when you need accuracy, that's where something like Pix comes in, that you actually need to be able to integrate your ground control, your checkpoint, that sort of thing.
All right. Okay, thank you. Who is actually flying drones on a regular basis for the projects right now? Oh, all right. Nice. A lot of Pix4D users? Okay, cool. All right. So a little review for some of those people, but also this will be hopefully a nice introduction to not just the software, but again, this actual science, and then how we can leverage the software to validate this accuracy. Call it a QA/QC, call it an audit. There's a number of different things that you can, terminology you could use to check this data for accuracy and quality, etc. And that's what we're going to walk through here. So I have a case study. I'm just going to kind of walk you right through that. This is the École Polytech Fédérale EPFL. Okay. This is a place in Switzerland where we did an accuracy assessment. When I say we, I mean Pix4D, the company. Reason being, actually I'll get to that in a minute, but let's just state this purpose right now, okay? Why are we looking to assess the accuracy of the EPFL? So we want to assess the absolute positional accuracy, okay? Where does this data exist in relationship to the real world? That's what we want to figure out right now, okay? Of a UAS photogrammetric survey using ASPRS standards. So we're going to get into these standards in more detail as we walk through this program. Okay, so how did we do it? Right? And this is a very general, without going every single little detail. Logan's kind of already doing that for you guys, right? So this is like a high-level rundown. So, what is the methodology? We fly a UAS over the EPFL using an autonomous flight application, in our case. Hey, we like Pix4D Capture. We use that. Okay. We used 5 GCPs for ground truthing. All right. 20 checkpoints, which are per ASPRS minimum requirements. Again, we're going to talk more about that. So that's a total of 25 shots that were supposed to be collected in the field. All right. Then, after the data is collected, we take that little fancy SD card, right? Pop it into our laptop and process it in Pix4D Mapper. Okay. Through that whole workflow, then we can assess the RMSE of the checkpoints per ASPRS positional accuracy standards. So that's what I'm going to show you here. Okay. Here's that EPFL. Here is the EPFL. It's actually the headquarters of Pix4D. It's in Lausanne, Switzerland. I don't know if you can see that right there, but there's Switzerland. Here's the Alps, and we're right there on the shore of Lake Geneva. I've heard it's beautiful. I haven't yet had a chance to be, but just a quick little ortho. What our software will do after you process your first step. Runs what's called bundle block adjustment. It'll give you a little preview of your ortho and also a digital surface model. These are handy if you're looking to, well, I don't want to say looking to, but if you're, well, you should. I wouldn't say want, but how about this? these are handy for reviewing your data set to make sure that there's no gaps in your flight path. Okay. In other words, maybe by no means, no intentional means of view, the app malfunctioned for some reason, or the drone malfunctioned for some reason, or the car, who knows, right? There's a lot of things that can happen in the field in real time. So if you ended up having 5 photos here that did not process, but you thought, or did not capture, but you thought they did, that would show up as a big white nothing right there. Okay, so that's why these things are nice. Anyway, so I'll digress. I don't want to go too much into that. A few more things about this. The Swiss Institute of Technology. So this is a very nice little complex, call it. There's a university there. There's a number of tech companies. 23 acres in sight. So it was a 1 battery flight. Okay. So what did we use? Okay, as far as our hardware, pretty straightforward. All right. DJI Phantom 4 Pro. Pretty tried and true. I mean, you could really call it industry standard right now. That RTK from DJI, I wholeheartedly believe that that will become the next big thing. I mean, we're already seeing, even at Pix4D, a lot of interest. It's just like Logan said, there's still a few, I guess we could say kinks to work out, but that's more on the understanding part of operating that drone. Not that it's a problem with that equipment, but it's understanding of the equipment. Okay. So yeah, this is what we did. This is what we used. Phantom 4 Pro. We like it because it's got GNSS built in, and it's got a 20 megapixel mechanical shutter. Very solid, large sensor. You know, for a small drone, hard to beat this combination. And the ease of use and cost. You know, who's got a Phantom 4 Pro that they fly regularly? Yeah, a lot of hands are going to go up, right? Okay, for our control points, we work with a surveyor, and they use this Trimble equipment, Trimble catalyst with a standard deviation in the horizontal of about 0.5 centimeter and vertical of about 1 centimeter. Okay, very simple and easy to use equipment, and we like this a lot. Yeah, so the flight itself, there's some kind of glitch with the graphic. There's supposed to be a bigger box here. Maybe it's just too bright or something. Anyways, the boundary is about right here, so imagine a box kind of going right around this. The flight itself, all right, this is like almost I'm repeating exactly what he just said, but this is the best practice. So in the front, 75% is what we flew. On the side, 75%, okay? Our altitude was 100 meters, so about 327 feet. That comes out to a GSD, okay, 2.85 centimeters. So a little bit larger. That means every single pixel in our final deliverable is going to have a pixel size slightly larger than an inch, okay, which is like right, still very, very tight. Overall, 231 images for 23 acres. Our control, we used good old UTM, okay, zone 32 north in Europe. Meters was the unit of choice, as it's not the United States. But yeah, again, five GCPs, 20 checkpoints, and we actually used photo identifiable targets. Okay, you'll see as it's an urban site, that can do you just fine as long as you're picking out identifiable targets that are clearly discernible in terms of what exactly you're going to use to, what we say, mark those images. Okay, when you're calling out where those images exist in relationship to the coordinate that you shot. Okay, GCPs. And so we have our flight like this. The one thing that I would like for us to do is update the color of the actual crosses. For right now, our GCPs and our checkpoints all come in as blue crosses. So watch this. When I say GCPs, on my screen it's a little brighter green, so about like this. Okay, and then here's our checkpoints. In hindsight, we could have done a little bit better, adding some over here, and even over here too. I think that's actually one that dropped off. But yeah, that's what we went with, and you'll see there's always a lesson learned kind of thing too, right? When we especially with what we're talking about here. You're not always going to get perfect data. It's like learn what you do and then try to aim for better results next time. But still, this came out very, very Very, very good, and I'll show you what that looks like.
If I can get one more compliment on the
Please.
last one too. That sort of checkpoint distribution is totally fine, especially if the area of interest is that developed parking lot. The fact that there's a gap of ground control and checkpoints in the lower left-hand corner is typically fine, especially because that's indicative that that's not an area of interest for the project. That's not part of the actual survey boundary. You're going to fly it over as well for extra data, but like that, when I look at that from doing a lot of survey projects, that looks perfect to me, right? Like absolutely perfect level of ground control and checkpoints, because you can kind of clearly tell where the actual area of interest is going to be.
Thank you. Okay, what does control look like? I mean, what does that even mean, right? It's just a text file. That's all it is. That's all that Pix4D means in terms of an input, okay? So a text file with what we call our ID, which would be what we name the GCP or the checkpoint with the specific number. So some type of structure that you have to this. Again, it's all about the little things. If you name them all the same thing, what good is that going to be? That's just going to cause confusion. We have our X coordinate, so our easting, our northing, and then our elevation. Okay? And it doesn't matter, you could also switch it around and go Y, X, Z, either way it works. As long as it's a simple CSV, comma-separated values like this. Okay. Yeah, so there's a little blown-up picture of what I was showing you earlier. We ended up capturing much more. You get this like data on the periphery, but in full disclosure, I wasn't there when they captured this, so I don't actually know if it was just the parking lot that was the primary purpose. I know that the imagery was collected all around here, so anyways, that's what the end results look like processed at full resolution. So there's a lot more to it too, and again, I can explain that more kind of on a side discussion if you want. Let's look at accuracy. All right, let's really dive into what we're all talking about here. What we need. So from Pix4D, you will get a report. All right, so a portion of your report, and there's actually supposed to be cells kind of populated here, but you get the idea. Yeah, so the software will output a PDF file for you with all the different little specifications and essentially like a progress report or your quality QA/QC or audit, whatever you want to call it, where you've got information about your overlap, you've got information about your flight path, and then, first and foremost, your control and your checkpoints. Right? So we pulled out all these checkpoints from our report like this. We've got the error between the X, Y, and Z. So each one of these, the report calls out what is what's called residual value. Right? Does anybody know what residual means? Yeah. You never know. Your data's here, your shot was here. What's that difference or that offset? Okay. Anyways, there's your residuals for each point. Projection error is something related to how well, really what's called the marks of the images that I'll show you, how well you went through and actually tell the software where those targets exist. So it's where all those rays ultimately meet each other, how well that is. That's stated in pixels. That's something that you want to see half of a pixel or less. That means that you're like right on that pinpoint dead center. You're never going to get that down to absolute zero, right? And then how many targets that you marked over here. Moving down, we have some evaluations. So we have a mean. Let's do an average of all these results. So our average in our X, our Y, and our Z. Our standard deviation between all those, and then finally our root mean square error down here. Okay. So this provides a lot of very useful information right in the report. All right. Any questions so far as I'm walking through this? Yeah.
Does it provide any indication of weak areas in your data?
In the checkpoints, if we had an outlier here, the label would turn red, and there would also be a note. I don't have it because this is just a screenshot, but the note would say 1 out of however many checkpoints came back. I think it says 2 inaccurate or something like that. There's some little qualifier that it gives you as a statement. In terms of the report, that's the only thing that we have. Can you think of anything else, like in the actual interface? I can't think of
Not the
anything else.
report.
There's
I mean,
been,
once you know the name, it's really easy to open
Yeah.
up the Ray Cloud and see which one it is.
right, right.
But as far as like regional errors, if one area is more error prone than the other, it doesn't indicate that specifically.
Yeah, and other than kind of visualizing the quantification, there's not, let's say, a visual cue where it just makes, you know, a bunch of red points or something in the point cloud being, oh, that's inaccurate.
But there's also a reason behind that is because there will always be error too.
Mhm.
And error is not even necessarily a bad thing. Well, quite frankly, error is inevitable.
Right.
It can't be a bad thing. It's always going to be there. It's up to you to determine what threshold of error is sufficient. There are some projects where 5 feet of error are enough because it's horribly inaccessible territory and you just want to do really, really, really rough topo. Whatever, great, process it, cool. But the fact is, I mean, honestly, if everything there was exactly 0, that'd be a bigger concern than anything else. That'd be a sign of bad data. Because error is real. There's error in the drone. There's error in the actual ground measurement tool as well.
No, you just have a very good photogrammetry.
I just a really, really good photograph.
After being at this conference. Yeah. Very good photogrammer that knows how to fudge data. How about that?
Yeah. Used to work at Enron.
Yeah. You know, so if there's anybody that has like feature requests or things that you know, like, hey, it'd be great if Pix4D could do this, talk to me after this course, and I'll be happy to pass that information along to our developers. Okay. All right. So yes, we have a report. There's a lot of nice information here. It's almost all there. And when I say almost all there, I mean in terms of what ASPRS standards actually need. So let's move on. Per ASPRS, okay, and you can actually, I replicated this table the Friday before this show by looking at the standards and just putting some due diligence into understanding exactly what's there. They've got sample tables of what your report is supposed to look like, okay? So pulled from the report residual values and populated it in here. So it's essentially the exact same information that I just showed you guys.
So
There-
this is
yes.
your own spreadsheet?
This is my spreadsheet. Yes, yes. But again, all this information is almost exactly the same thing as this. But I did build this spreadsheet independently. But it took me maybe an hour and a half, and it was just literally copying and pasting and making sure and like putting everything exactly the same way that the standard has it in the 25-page report. And yeah, and the nice thing about with Excel, you can just populate formulas. It's actually quite nice. So what we want to really pull out on all of this is down here. Okay, so I know that's very difficult to see. How about I make that bigger for you? Bam. We've got our X, our Y, and our Z. Now I know I said that originally we did 20 checkpoints, and that was the intention, but again, okay, so lesson learned. There were a couple that dropped off, not just from, again, I wasn't there, but some that were outside of the extents. So we ended up with 16. And as we'll go through the lecture more, we really need to have 20, especially if that whole area is, well, actually it doesn't matter if it's that whole area or if it's a smaller area. At the end of the day, the standards say 20 checkpoints is the minimum requirement. So we're a little low, but let's just kind of, you know, not that we're going to dismiss it, but we realize that we'll make sure we do that better next time, all right? Okay, so 16, and that's what I was calling out here. And that's what we're looking for. Our mean error, that's the same thing from our report. Our standard deviation, same thing. RMSE, same exact thing, okay? Per ASPRS, they make a nice little kind of reference for you in terms of what your RMSE of your this would be for your horizontal. No, I'm sorry, this would be for your, what am I saying now? Am I saying the wrong thing? No, that is the horizontal. Yeah, this is the horizontal, I'm sorry, yeah, X and Y. Okay, so this is both X and Y together, and then we have something called 95% confidence interval, which you take your RMSE of this times by that number, and then for your vertical, take your RMSE here and times it by this, and that would be your 95% confidence interval. All right? This is right out of the ASPRS standards document. All right? If you don't know where to find that, ask one of us after this, or like 50 people at this conference. Okay, so having all that information, I want to state now Okay, it's one thing I want to really make this a concise report that I'm going to hand off to my client, right? So that they feel confident in what I'm delivering to them. So again, I copied and pasted this exactly from the ASPRS standards. Okay, standards document. A nice little qualitative statement which also calls out specific qualifiers here. So I'm going to say the data set was tested to meet ASPRS positional standards for digital geospatial data for a 5 centimeter. So let me show you that 5 centimeter here. This is in the horizontal 5 centimeter RMSE horizontal accuracy class. Actual positional accuracy was found to be 0.9 of a centimeter, so less than a centimeter, so 900ths, right? 9 millimeters, and then 1.2 centimeters, which would be there and there. Okay. Now, why, if this is 9 millimeters and this is 1.2 centimeters, why am I saying that the data is only called this 5 centimeter accuracy class? Seems a little odd, right? Shouldn't it be lower than that? So look, with this data, I'm not going to say that it's, let's call it this. You never want to call out the accuracy, even if it comes back like this. You never want to classify it as anything less than your ground sampling distance. Okay, so let's go back, way back here to the very, there it is right there. Okay, this is very important. My ground sampling distance is 2.85. Therefore, when I go to my table from ASPRS, I don't know if you guys can see, but that's a 2.5 right there. So I'm just beyond being in this acceptable range. So I got to bump myself down here if I'm going to call this out. But that's the nice thing about that statement that's provided, is I can say, yes, this is where I fall in terms of a classification, but the reality was I was here and here. Okay? And at 95% confidence interval, I'm actually right about where my ground sampling distance was for this project. Let's move on to vertical. Any questions? No? So let's move on to vertical. Very similar kind of workflow, all right? Almost identical statement, except you're just looking for a few different things. So the data set was tested to meet positional accuracy standards for a 10 centimeter, bam, right there. RMS into Z, vertical accuracy class. Actual, and that's NVA, non-vegetated accuracy, was found to be 5.5 centimeters, equating to a plus or minus of 10.4 centimeters in the 95% confidence interval. If this was highly vegetated, we would call it out at 10.4 centimeters. Okay, that's it. So yes, how did I get to 10? That was because my because my RMSC, I know you can't really see that, but the RMSC here is 5, and we were 5.5. So because of that, I'm going to bump myself down to be on the safe side as I'm reporting this, trying to be as appropriate as possible. Okay. Any follow-ups on that? What are we doing up to now?
We have half an hour, so we're good.
Oh, cool. Okay. So I'll walk through this pretty quickly then. Actually, I'll just sit down. Sure. The wire reaches. No, it doesn't. So I'll swap that out with you. Okay. All right. So I'm going to walk through pretty quickly how easy it is to implement ground control and checkpoints into a project in Pix4D. Bear with me 1 second. Okay. So here's our EPFL project, and I've already processed. I'm not going to walk through the whole process of all the steps. That's a whole other class you can talk to me about that I do at a different place. But let's talk about accuracy and how did I get to that assessment that I just presented to you guys. I've already processed my, let's say, what's called step 1 of the project. What we have here is called automatic tie points. This would be after our bundle block adjustment. Okay, so think of this like this is the foundation of our project. Once we get to this stage, now we want to go ahead and put that ground control and checkpoints in. so that we can what's called register our data to our ground truth. Okay, so I've got a data set here, and it's in 3D, and I can zoom in and rotate around, all that good stuff. But what I want to show you now, there's no GCPs called out yet. I'm going to go to this little button right here that says GCP Manager, and we have a little window. Okay. First thing that I want to always check is that my coordinate system is correct. Now, this is something that you establish during the project creation wizard, so I'm not going to go back and show you how to do all that. I just want you to understand that this is very important that you at least eyeball this to make sure that it's the right system and the right datums, etc., that your, that your control has been captured as. Okay, so I'm good there. I'm going to go right over here. Oh, before I do that, actually, let me show you something. The control file, I know I showed you it was a text file, but just for reference, here it is converted. Uh-oh, that's not going to help. That's all it takes, guys. That's all it takes. Okay? So I'm going to load this information into the software now. And I do that by saying import GCPs. And I say browse, find that file. So I always save my stuff in a folder called control. And it's this one right here. I've labeled it to my coordinate system so I know exactly which file it is. I'll say open. And the order, in this case, I like to always label my controls so that I know, and so that anybody else knows if they go back and do this too. But the order is going to be X, Y, and Z, so easting, northing, that's fine. Okay, there it is. Okay, so this is just a basic little table populated now. Things to look out for are the name of the points here. So check this out. I've got CKP, and I've got a whole bunch of CKPs, numbers something, something, something. And then as I scroll down, I've got GCP 1, 3, 17, 19, 20, 5 GCPs in total. Okay. Before I move on, I'm going to go here, and I'm going to grab all of the cells where my checkpoints are labeled, and I'm just going to right-click on what's called the type, and I'm going to say edit those, and I'm going to switch it from what's called 3D GCP to a checkpoint. Okay? If I don't do that, then the points are not going to be an independent measurement. They will actually act like ground control points. Okay? These down here are still called 3D GCPs. So these will provide the bias and the registration. These will be our independent verification. Okay? Okay. Now on the screen you can see, kind of in faint colors, I like to call these pins. These are the visual locations of all of our ground control points and our checkpoints. The ground control points show up in blue, so there's one right there. And the checkpoints show up as kind of this cyan color. Okay? So there's still a little bit of legwork left, where now if you look at my what I call layers here, I've got my points labeled or called out for me, so I can just simply click on one of them to begin the what's called marking process. All right, now this is me telling the software where these points exist in relationship to the photos. And then after that's all gone and done through, software will do what's called a re-optimization, which is a, let's call it re-registering of the data set to the control. Okay? But it's very simple. I'm only going to walk through a couple of these. I'll show you what it does. Here's a little trick for the Pix4D users out there that have not seen this before. If I move my mouse over this point and I say spacebar on my keyboard, yeah, nice, right? So I can zoom in, and that is the location of my first, in this case it's GCP. So right on the corner, yellow corner, as again I said, these are photo identifiable points. Okay? So yellow corner works well with the contrast, and I'm just going to say like this, bang. Left click on my mouse. I have told the software now that that's where the point exists in relationship to everything else. So spacebar again, and I'll do it one more time, and I'll zoom in, and I'll hit that point, and now I can say apply. And as soon as I do that, and I would actually go through and mark more of these, 10 to 15 to be more precise. But as soon as I do that, and I do that for all the rest of the points listed here, okay, I can move on to the next step, and the next steps of the processing workflow. You never want to process a project 1, 2, 3 blindly, and then go back. That's a waste of time. Don't do that, okay? Be very systematic in your approach to processing. It's just like flying. Make a checklist for yourself, standard operating procedure, all that kind of stuff. All right, so I've got an example here of a fully processed project with all of the checkpoints and ground control, processed and marked. So here's my example. And we notice now if I look at my points here, this is what I want you to keep an eye on. So I hope that we can change the order of operations here, how this is labeled. But what's important is what's called our initial position. So that would be what our shot, okay? That comes directly from our control point text file. Our computed position, that's the location in the data set where everything exists, okay? So it's essentially this minus this will ultimately give us these residuals right here, okay? Error to GCP, we should say error to checkpoint initial position, you get the idea, okay? These little three numbers here are what populate that report, which ultimately then get calculated to more stuff, okay? So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and pass it back over to Logan because I know there's a few more lecture slides, and if anybody has questions about this after class, please pull me aside and I'll be happy to answer more in-depth questions. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Any experience with the propeller ground control point?
Oh, the propeller arrow points?
Yes.
Ground control points? Yep. Definitely have some experience with them. They are, in my experience, very good, very high quality, and typically a good solution if you don't have any other form of ground control point that you can use. One slight downside is their antenna is going to be low to the ground and it's L1 band GPS only, which means it's not, if you have a Trimble R10 actual GPS rover, that's typically going to be slightly more accurate, but that's also criminally expensive at about 18 grand or something like that for a single rover. Blah blah blah. Propeller arrow points are honestly fantastic. We work with Propeller a lot as well. They work really well in areas that are wide open, not a lot of buildings or GPS multipathing, and where you can actually leave your points out for a while. That said, if you do already have access to true dual band survey grade equipment, we've typically found that that's better if you already have it. But we also use them. They're mostly designed for mines, quarries, open pits, and that sort of thing. And for that, they're spectacular. All right.
They do show up well in Pix4D too, just by the way.
Yeah.
They're a great solution for
Yeah, easy to see.
Yeah.
Yep. And you can use them as both ground control and checkpoints too, because really that's all you care about, that just XYZ coordinates. So, all right, so kind of summarizing what he went through, verifying accuracy with the positional accuracy standards, ASPRS positional accuracy standards for digital geospatial data as of 2014 are the specific ones. By just kind of show of hands, is anyone in here a member of ASPRS already? Members, certified? Oh, perfect, lots of people. Great. So you've probably seen a lot of these. When we talk accuracy, this is the Bible for us. It's 30 some odd pages of often extremely detailed analytical data about all of the different caveats, vegetated, non-vegetated area, even how to integrate LiDAR data, things of how you are measuring, what tools you're using to measure checkpoints, that sort of thing. If you haven't looked through them before, we highly recommend it. They're really, really good, especially partly because they're sensor agnostic. Whether you're using a GoPro, a $1 million metrically calibrated camera, or LiDAR, or truly anything, you can actually use their accuracy standards to measure and report accuracy. That said, they very intentionally do not specify the best practices of how to get there. That's what this class is about. What we found to be some of the best practices to get there. So the ASPRS positional accuracy standards will tell you if your data sucks, it just won't tell you how to fix it. But it will also tell you if your data is good. So we talked about horizontal accuracy class, RMSE, root mean squared error. It's a statistical measure of accuracy. You must use checkpoints, not ground control points. It should be measured by an independent source of higher accuracy. That's another one of those caveats in there that when you're measuring the ground points, it is impossible to have a reported accuracy that is better than the inherent error in your ground measurement tool. I know Jeff said it was measured, his ground control points were measured with a Trimble catalyst with a horizontal error of 0.5 centimeter. Great. That means that there's no way you're going to get anything better than 0.5 centimeter, but there's also other GPS equipment out there that has differing levels of accuracy. If you're using GPS equipment that only provides 5 centimeters of accuracy on the ground, because maybe there's bad network coverage, whatever, then that means your final reportable accuracy cannot be better than 5 centimeters. Even if the checkpoints match, because there's error inherent in that ground measurement, there's error there as well. And to meet the standards of tested to meet, you need a minimum of 20 checkpoints. Now, actually, I'll get there in a second. So minimum of 20 checkpoints to actually meet those standards. Error compounds, right? There are a bunch of different sources of error, from setting and marking your ground control points, whether they're distributed, what the targets look like, mission plan overlap, high relief sites. We've been through tons of them here, but there are honestly more sources of error that can compound as well. One way of example of something that's impossible to predict is, let's say you're flying your drone and you happen to be flying through an area with a particularly big bug. And that particularly big bug gets sucked into the propeller and leaves a particularly big amount of bug guts on that propeller that knocks it slightly out of balance, ever so slightly imperceptibly out of balance. And that introduces a vibration into the drone that's not perfectly canceled by all the systems on the drone. So now you have a little bit of vibration, and that leaves a little bit of kind of error on the camera itself. The camera itself might be is going to be vibrating, maybe by as much as a full pixel, something that's absolutely imperceptible to the human eye, but you've got a little bit of error, and that sort of vibration. By the time you come down, it's flung those bug guts off, you never see it again on the propeller, but there's a source of error that's just been added that there is absolutely nothing you can do to get around. That's going to be it. There's always error inherent in the project. We don't operate in laboratory conditions. There are 100 things like that that could add to the error, and this is why you need to actually measure your accuracy and measure your error and understand that there is error and accuracy inherent in every single project. So, quite frankly, part of the reason we go through all of this and why we even like Pix4D is because photogrammetry is hard. I wish I could say that after this class or after anything that you could be a certified mapping scientist or a certified photogrammetrist or blah, 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 but it takes a lot of experience to be able to pick out every single error. Pix4D makes it absolutely ridiculously easy to go through it, but it still takes the human eye to go through the mission planning and understand and report on what the accuracy actually is. So that's why we're here. And honestly, I imagine that's why you guys are here too, is because you recognize that this is a skill, something that you need to be good at, you need to be trained at. Being able to see and understand the issues that are caused by camera calibration and ground control and lighting and coordinate systems. And that's the reason why photogrammetrists are scientists. So for those of you that are not members of ASPRS, I strongly, strongly encourage you to actually pursue that designation, to actually work with ASPRS, become a photogrammetrist, mapping scientist, something along those lines. It's a really, really great organization. I swear I'm not paid to say that. In general, too, we think fixing problems takes 3 steps. 1, you got to realize that there actually is a problem. The most dangerous problems are the ones that you don't even know are there. 2, you have to figure out what actually caused the problem. And 3, then you have to either fix it or avoid it next time. I'll just go through, because I know we're coming up a little bit close to the end. We've got about 15 minutes left. Just some errors more errors that we see in real life projects. I always like using real life projects with these sorts of things, because these aren't, some perfectly manicured example of how the world ought to work. This is all live, real data that we've seen from clients. This is a project that just was processed into multiple blocks. The way it works, there's a whole bunch of trees in this big white gap in the middle. Really dense foliage for whatever reason, because of mission planning, couldn't be properly reconstructed. They didn't care about it anyway, but what they cared about were like these areas and then these areas. So when they process in multiple blocks, you need to know you have your ground control points here, and then this area, this is effectively a separate project from that area, even if you process them all together. Here's some other errors there with photogrammetry. This is a particularly bad looking one, but perfectly uniform colors are very, very difficult to stitch accurately in photogrammetry. This can be very freshly paved asphalt, or sometimes a fresh light dusting of snow can actually do the same thing, and it causes errors and artifacts that looks like this. This actually typically isn't that big of a problem because even just gravel, oil slicks, junk on a road is enough that Pix can match it up and stitch it into a nice smooth surface, but it's something to be aware of. You need to then edit out of the surface after the fact. Because that won't show up, or it might show up depending on how you do it, in the checkpoints. If you had a checkpoint that was unmarked in the middle of the road, then that would show up as an error if it wound up on one of those things, and you want to be able to adjust for those types of errors when there are still artifacts in the photogrammetry process. Like I said, annoying real-world things can actually happen. GCPs shot across multiple days can cause a certain level of inconsistency. The cameras can be physically knocked out of calibration. You work in the field, people throw these things into trucks, you knock that image sensor off of its mount by a single pixel, and all of a sudden you're off by a tenth without even noticing it. GCP targets can get moved in the real world. Typically we don't like using the bare minimum of GCPs even when they're there because they get moved. We had one project a client submitted to us where they set the control one day, went and flew it the next day, and we saw in these photos that kids, or at least I'm assuming it was kids, broke into the site to do donuts, and when they were doing donuts on their car, they drove over one of the ground control points, or two of the ground control points, shredded them, and threw them out the back of the car. So when they flew the project site the next day, there weren't enough ground control points. Sorry, you gotta refly it. That really sucks, but real world happens. Real world can be a pain sometimes.
If you use cloth targets and you're in a rural area, like a ranch or something, cows love to eat cloth targets, so be careful of that as well, just from personal experience.
And if you use the targets that are from a gun range, people come up and shoot them.
Right.
So reporting accuracy, we went through Pix4D's example of actually checking it with 20 checkpoints, but there are actually two different standards. There is one that is tested to meet the standards, that's where you need those minimum 20 checkpoints, and then there is produced to meet, and that's what I was talking about earlier that says, hey, we've done this a lot, we've tested it in the past, we have a lot of confidence in this system. Maybe we only set 5 independent checkpoints this time, and it actually worked out. The 5 checkpoints worked out, but it's not enough to hit this higher level of reporting, but it is enough to meet this lower level of reporting. So that's kind of the difference between your tested to meet versus produced to meet.
And the bottom statement, that's because you're certified, you can basically say that, and you've done, like I said, you've used 5 checkpoints.
Yeah, exactly. You need to have enough reason. There's more language in the standards, I forget exactly what it is. But you need to have very, very good reason to believe that there is nothing substantially different between this and a similar project that happened. Now, you need to be a trained photogrammetrist to know that, right? Because if you go back to some of the other errors that I saw, like that body of water that would split something into 2 blocks, if you weren't trained to know that that can actually totally screw up a project, someone might slap this on and say, hey, we produced it to meet because I set 5 ground control points, I flew it at 500 feet. Well, that's not enough. You need to actually have good reason and experience to be able to put this in. And this is something that, I mean, I don't know what would happen if you weren't certified and you wrote this on a paper. I doubt, the FBI is going to come knocking. But a lot of your more reputable organizations, especially when you start going to larger engineers, surveying companies, all the way up to things like the Army Corps of Engineers, they're going to check your credentials and make sure that you're certified, and when you say this, you know what you're talking about. And in fact, that's for a lot of how this kind of works in business too. A lot of big businesses, when you're putting in a bid for these sorts of projects, you've got to submit your credentials. And if a surveyor is putting in a bid for a huge project, they're going to submit, heck, maybe my credentials as a photogrammetrist that's actually working on this. So that when it goes through this process, these statements actually carry weight. I mean, anyone can copy paste, right? But it takes someone that actually has the experience, the training, the background, the authority to say this for it to actually mean something and for it to actually carry weight in the commercial realm. So there's still another step. Pix4D is the best software in the world, but getting a 15 gigabyte point cloud is not the end of the line for most people. In fact, that's a huge part of what all of the ILMF conferences, that is much of the rest of this whole show, is great. Now you have a point cloud and tons of other rich, wonderful, perfectly accurate and certified data. What's the next step? Well, I showed this at the beginning, right? This is what a lot of people, not for every project, but a lot of people want to get to. It's a lot of this culture, this data, this line work. And for that, you need to actually draft, extract, finish your line work and get it into CAD. So this to kind of go back to that office field workflow, this is our preferred workflow on the this kind of secondary side. The photogrammetry side, all of our photogrammetrists use Pix4D. For the line work drafting side, there are a whole bunch of different options out there. Virtual Survey and Global Map are some of our favorites, but you can use Revit, Topodot, VRMesh, some many other point cloud processing softwares out there. This is often one of the most time-consuming steps. Also, shameless product plug. This is one of the things that we do as a service at Aerotas. Come check us out if you want it. And also then finishing it in CAD too. So going from a full resolution ortho photo, full resolution giant point cloud into a final deliverable that you can print, sign, stamp, and seal on a single page PDF with perfect understanding of the accuracy and reliability there in CAD, Carlson, that sort of thing. That's going to be really really important step. So this is what one of those intermediate steps might actually look like, where you actually have individual topo points. You get your full orthophoto 3D model point cloud out of Pix4D. You select a grid of individual elevation points. We've got our curve lines here. Curves, for anyone that's a surveyor, are best defined by 4 lines: face, gutter, top, and back. Your edge of concrete, that's kind of what's going to show up on the final map, and will let you create a lightweight, clean 3D surface. This also, I don't think we have it that much stuff in here. We got some like bushes that it interpolates under, but this you'd also clean so that it goes underneath cars, tractors, conveyor belts, all the stuff that you don't want on a final survey. You'll want to clean out of your, in the drafting process, out of your final survey. Same thing, automated contours are very useful for visualization, but from a surveying and final mapping standpoint, they face challenges. No one, when they're actually planning a project site, wants to see all of the contours around individual cars and trucks. You want those to be cleaned out. That's why you want to actually have a human hand off in drafting this. There's some kind of machine learning and artificial intelligence tools that are advancing this process. They're getting closer and closer every day, but right now this is still quite a manual process, even though there are a number of tools out there that will accelerate the process. So yeah, then finish it in CAD.
Can I say one thing?
Oh,
actually?
yeah.
I just want to say one thing. Sorry, but if you go back, for anybody in here, I think I'm going to see a couple hands at least, I hope, that do stereo photogrammetry. Good, awesome. Okay, that's awesome. Because I just wanted to make one note that Pix4D, you can extract the bundle block that will have all your EO and camera information, etc., that you need for a stereo software. Load that right into there. And if you're more comfortable working in stereo to establish your line work and your other additional topo work, by all means, that's a totally viable solution. So that's all I wanted to say.
Yep, absolutely. So yeah, getting it into CAD, finishing it into CAD, where you merge in your field shots, you actually create a CAD surface, add your culture and annotation, things like street names, any deed information or property boundary information that was pulled off of public records, right-of-ways, subterranean features, stuff like that that wouldn't come from the field anyway. Put your seal on it and print it out. And again, the goal is to get it to be like this, indistinguishable. No idea whether or not it was taken by a drone or not. That's the end goal for a lot of this stuff. So here's kind of broadly speaking, a lot of the tools we use. So you saw the same thing with Pix4D, AirMap, Google Earth, Trimble Catalyst for your ground equipment, DJI for hardware, Pix4D for processing, a whole bunch of different stuff for line work, and then finishing it in CAD. And so with that wraps up the presentation. I know I referenced a couple of things. If you guys want, you can drop me your business card and I will send you a copy of our field checklists, as well as like the ASPRS positional accuracy standards as well. And if you have any other questions, I'll open up the floor to questions. I know we've got a couple of minutes before we're supposed to let you go, but thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it.